What's the hardest thing you've had to forgive, or never could?
Every year, my family posted a group photo without me, and it used to sting in a way I could hide behind polite jokes and busy schedules. But this year, they did not even bother to invite me. So I rented a billboard across from my grandmother's house with my face and the words Forbes 30 under 30 in letters, so big you could read them from the end of the block. And I did it not because I needed their attention, but because I was done being edited out like I never existed, and I wanted the first person who would see me, really see me, to be the one who taught me to stop apologizing for taking up space. If you want the backstory that makes this make sense, it is not complicated, because it is the same story you hear from a lot of people who outgrow the version of themselves their family prefers to keep. Where you spend your 20s building something they say is not a real job, where holidays are a performance review you did not ask for, where your sister Hannah posts a caption about family being everything while you are the empty space between your brother Jake's shoulder and your mother Linda's smile, and your father Robert calls it tough love when he reminds you that stability matters more than dreams, and then when the dream becomes a company with payroll and investors and more responsibility than anyone warned you about. The family group chat goes quiet because silence is easier to manage than admitting they were wrong. This time, the silence was not even quiet. It was loud in the way only an empty calendar can be, because there was no call from my mother asking if I needed a ride, no polite check-in from my sister pretending she thought I was out of town, no accidental double text from my Aunt Carol with directions and a winky face, absolutely nothing, just a new photo going up late in the evening with all of them crowded together on my grandmother Evelyn's porch, arms slung, and eyes bright in that way people look when they believe they've done the right thing for the peace of the family, and beneath it a caption about tradition, and I stared at that caption longer than I cared to admit, and I realized they had finally said the quiet part out loud, because tradition, to them, now officially meant without me. I could have replied with a paragraph about boundaries and respect, and for a whole hour I drafted and deleted a message that tried to be the bigger person, but being bigger had for years meant being invisible. And while I was sitting there with my phone face down, I remembered that I am no longer the person who waits for permission to take control of my own story. So I opened my laptop, typed the name of a media company I once negotiated with, found the outdoor division, and began clicking through a map until I saw a rectangle marked as available that sat directly across the street from my grandmother's front windows, a spot no one could miss if they pulled into her driveway or walked out her door, which meant a spot that would sit in the center of every family arrival and goodbye. The sales rep asked for artwork and timing, and for a second I felt ridiculous, because who rents a billboard to make a point to their family without looking unhinged? But then I remembered the photo from last year where my cousin joked in the comments that I must have been the one holding the camera, and the one from the year before that where a neighbor asked who the missing person was, and my sister replied with a laughing face, as if the joke were harmless, and my fingers stopped shaking and I uploaded a clean headshot from a recent press kit, added the magazine pull quote with Forbes spelled out like a verdict, and set the line beneath it to say, in plain words, that being left out taught me to build my own table and then invite who I wanted. Which was just me this time, and I chose the install date for the week my grandmother hosts the after-church lunch that everyone treats like a roll call for belonging. Before I hit pay, I asked the rep one more question about visibility at different hours, and she told me the morning angle is strongest, because the sun sits behind the street and throws the image forward. Which made me laugh, because even the light wanted to help make the point for me, and I signed the contract with a rush of relief that surprised me. Not a petty high, not a cruel thrill, just the calm of finally acting instead of explaining. And I added a small line of text that only my grandmother would immediately recognize, an inside nod to the story she told me as a kid about how she once took the long road rather than sit where she was told, and I knew she would get it before anyone else did. If you are wondering whether I told anyone, I did not, because I wanted the first phone call to be honest, not staged, not the kind of call where someone warns the rest to control the narrative. And I scheduled the delivery window for the very morning they always gather on that porch, and I closed my laptop and went to make dinner with my hands still buzzing. Because sometimes the most generous thing you can do for people who pretend you are not there is to become impossible to ignore without saying a single word to them directly. And just before I fell asleep, with my phone turned face down again, the sales rep emailed the final confirmation and a photo of the empty frame where my face would be, and I stared at that blank space and realized I was not angry anymore. I was focused. Which is a much more dangerous version of me, because when I decide to finish something, I finish it, and in the morning my grandmother would open her curtains, look across the street, and see the granddaughter who stopped asking to be included and started writing her own invitation, while everyone else would be pulling into her driveway, and that is where I decided the first piece of payback would land, right in the middle of their tradition. With one more choice, they would not be able to ignore waiting for them on the other side of the glass. By the time the first car door slammed across the street and the porch started filling with the same careful smiles that always seem to appear when people are about to perform family unity for an audience they curated themselves, my phone lit up with a name I actually wanted to see, because my grandmother never calls to scold or to pry or to pretend that exclusion is healthy when everybody knows it is not. She calls to ask if I ate and whether the new office chairs are hurting my back end. Whether I remembered to keep my passport in the fireproof box, and the first thing she said, in that steady voice of hers that can quiet a room without raising an eyebrow, was that she saw the billboard and that she hoped I meant it as a message to her more than a message to anyone else, which told me she had read the small line at the bottom that only she could decode. And I told her I did, and that I loved her, and that I was not coming over because I had promised myself I would stop walking into rooms where I was expected to prove I belonged, and she paused just long enough for my chest to loosen and said she understood, then asked if she should put on a pot of coffee in case I changed my mind, because she knows that the possibility of a welcome sometimes matters more than the actual visit. While I was still on the call, the texts began stacking in that frantic way people text when something is spinning out of their control, and they are very sure you must fix it right away, with my sister Hannah asking whether this was really necessary, and my mother Linda leaving a voice message about humiliation and neighbors and decency, and my brother Jake chiming in with a half-joke about free advertising and could I at least have picked a less aggressive font, which would have been funny if it were not the kind of nudge he always uses to minimize whatever is inconvenient for him to see, and I let the screen glow on the table while I told my grandmother she might hear an announcement after the service, and that she should not be startled, because for once I wanted her name to be said with something like pride that was not attached to how well she kept her porch plants alive or how she mailed birthday cards on time. What I had set in motion cost a fraction of the hungry years when I slept in a shared apartment and scraped enough to take one more course that everyone insisted was a hobby, because a month ago, when the nomination email for the list came through and the press requests started piling into my inbox, I called the church office and asked the pastor if he would be open to introducing a small scholarship in my grandmother's maiden name, aimed at first-generation college kids or kids who had been told to be realistic when they wanted something that did not fit the family template. And I told him I would fund the first several years, and that I wanted the announcement to happen on the very day the porch would be crowded with the people who had confused love with control. And he said yes with the kind of warmth that made me feel like I was not being ridiculous, so I wired the money and wrote the application note in plain words a teenager could actually hear, and I scheduled a short press release to the local paper with a photo of my grandmother clipping an article to her fridge that did not exist yet but would by afternoon. Because I build products for a living and because timing is a product decision, I also bought a church bulletin dedication in her name that would sit on the page across from the hymns. And I paid for a geofence set of ads that would appear on the phones of anyone standing within a tight radius of her block during the lunch hour. Not because I needed to brag, but because I wanted the information to find the right kids even if the adults did not pass it along, and then I asked the Billboard company to switch the creative at noon to a line that said invite people while they are still asking, with a smaller tag that simply said thank you, Evelyn, for teaching me to keep going when it was easier to sit down. And I knew that if anyone in my family decided to call it petty, they would have to say the word petty while looking at her name. 10 minutes after the service ended, the pastor stepped up to the microphone in the fellowship hall and announced the scholarship while the potato salad line froze and the folding chairs squeaked. And a teenager near the back clapped first, and then someone else did, and then there was a ripple of that careful applause people give when they do not quite know who gets to claim the credit, and right on cue the local paper's photographer, who had agreed to stop by if the timing worked, took a quick photo of my grandmother holding the oversized envelope I had sent over with the church secretary earlier that morning, and my mother texted me that this was a stunt and that decent people do not ambush their families with public gestures. Which made me laugh in a way that tasted like relief, because there is nothing more honest than the moment when someone tells you that your quiet success is only acceptable if it makes them the center of the story. For my own small act of revenge inside all that kindness, I had written the scholarship criteria so that every applicant would have to write a short paragraph about the person who believed in them when it was unpopular to do so. And I asked the pastor to name my grandmother as the first honorary reader, which meant that for the next year, she would be the one hearing the voices of kids nobody ever invited to anything important. And my family would have to sit with the fact that she was now officially attached to a legacy that flowed outside their approval system. And as my grandmother called me back from her quiet bedroom to tell me through happy tears that she felt seen, a second call started buzzing in from an unfamiliar number. And when I let it go to voicemail, the transcript preview flashed a single sentence from a reporter who said the feature was approved and they would like to film where the story began if I could be there by evening, at my grandmother's porch, with family. If possible, which set the table for a choice I knew would make the next move land exactly where it would hurt and heal at the same time. When I called the reporter back, I did it with the same steady tone I use when I am leading an investor update, because if the story was going to be filmed on my grandmother's porch, then it had to be framed around what that porch had come to mean, which was a place where invitations decided who counted and who did not. So I laid out the terms that mattered to me, that we would not film any minors, that my grandmother's consent would be written and respected, that the angles would be about community and possibility and not about family drama for the sake of clicks, and that if any relative wanted to appear they would be welcome on one clear condition. Namely that they sign a simple release and that they read one sentence on camera that affirmed the scholarship and the kids it was designed to help. Because if they were going to enjoy the warmth of my recognition, then they could step into a little light of accountability while they were at it. I drove over early with a stack of folders that I slid into my grandmother's kitchen drawer after explaining each line. And she touched my wrist and told me that she did not mind the cameras if it meant one more kid would see that getting overlooked does not have to end the story. And while she was pinning up the freshly printed bulletin notice with her maiden name in bold type, I walked back to the porch and taped a small sign that said, "Filming in progress, community welcome, bring a name of a student you believe in," because I wanted the neighbors who always waved from their mailboxes to feel they had more right to stand in that frame than the people who had decided I made the picture messy. With the time set for late afternoon, I dropped a message into the family group thread that said there would be a short feature on the scholarship and the magazine recognition, that they were invited to join on the porch if they wanted to be heard in their own words, that there would be appearance releases at the door like any normal shoot, and that the crew would otherwise use publicly available photos to illustrate the tradition we all knew by heart, and I attached the link to last year's post. That had shown the tidy rows of faces and the tidy count that had somehow never included me, because I wanted them to understand that hiding behind silence was no longer an option once the conversation moved into daylight. They arrived in small packs. First my aunt with that fixed smile she saves for bake sales and funerals, then my brother Jake with a careful casual swagger that telegraphed how badly he wanted to be able to say he had been supportive all along. And behind them my mother in a blazer that looked like an apology wrapped in authority, with my sister Hannah trailing and scrolling as if the phone could provide an exit ramp, and before anyone could declare ownership over the schedule I introduced the producer, handed out the releases, and pointed to the sentence I had highlighted for each of them, a sentence that read almost the same for everyone, that they supported the new scholarship named after Evelyn, that they recognized kids who had been told to be realistic deserve a louder yes, and that they acknowledged the family porch had not always felt like a place for every voice, which was a sentence so simple and so kind that only a person protecting a lie could feel attacked by it. My mother asked whether the acknowledgement was necessary because it sounded accusatory, and I said that if the shoe pinched it could be removed by not wearing it anymore. And I added that I had included an alternate path where the person could choose to read the positive line without the acknowledgement so long as they agreed to stand behind my grandmother, while she read a short dedication that declared the porch open to applicants of every kind, which meant that either way the frame would show them aligned with inclusion on a day they might have preferred to control from a safer distance, and the producer, who understood story without being cruel, nodded and said that we would keep it simple and move fast. We rolled, and my grandmother went first with a voice that had lifted a dozen school fundraisers and 100 quiet afternoons, thanking the community, thanking the church, and naming the first scholarship window in a way that sounded like a door swinging wide. And then the camera moved to my mother, who read the alternate line with a smile that wobbled at the edges, and to my sister, who swallowed and said she believed in kids who are told to be realistic, and to my brother, who tried to add a joke and got a gentle cut from the producer, and then to me, where I looked straight through the lens and said that exclusion can be a furnace or a freezer depending on your choices, and that I chose to make heat, and that today was about more than me. And while the boom operator stepped back, a neighbor girl raised her hand from the sidewalk and asked if she could say the name of the friend who had been told he would never pass algebra, and when she did, the crew caught the kind of moment every editor loves because it reveals character without saying so. For the finishing beat, I had planned a small piece of theater that felt like justice instead of punishment, so I opened a new frame on my grandmother's living room wall where the last several years of holiday group photos had been arranged in neat chronology, slid in a fresh print that the photographer had just handed over of my grandmother and me surrounded by the kids who had gathered on the steps, and I asked the crew to capture the way the new photos sat at eye height while the old ones shifted upward just out of reach. Then I asked the reporter to include one closing line on air that the porch would host an open mailbox for scholarship nominations, and that every card dropped inside would be read by Evelyn herself, which tied the frame back to the person who had earned it without asking. As the camera packed up and my relatives calculated how to spin what had just happened into something tidy for their friends, the producer's phone buzzed with a message she winced at before she showed me. A short note from someone who had sent her a tip claiming that my company's valuation was smoke and that a former colleague would go on the record to say I had exaggerated revenue, which read exactly like the kind of sabotage a relative might think is clever in the moment. And while she promised to fact-check and keep me updated, I felt the familiar slide of anger turning into focus, because I knew precisely who would make that call, and I knew exactly which document I would publish next. One quiet page that would end the question and start a new fire at the same time. When the producer's phone buzzed with that warning about a so-called former colleague claiming my revenue was smoke and mirrors, I knew instantly that this was not coming from an outsider with a real grievance, but from someone close enough to the family orbit to think that a half-truth dropped at the right moment could unspool everything I had built. Because no stranger cares that deeply about timing unless they have an axe to grind that is personal rather than professional. My company's books are not just solid, they are verified every quarter by auditors who do not care about family politics, and while I had never before considered weaponizing transparency as a form of revenge, the pettiness of the leak made the decision obvious, because if you want to silence whispers, you do not argue with them, you drown them in undeniable receipts. I went home that night, pulled up the quarterly audit report that had been prepared for investors only a week earlier, scrubbed the sensitive employee data, and posted a public link with a short message that any journalist, analyst, or curious reader was welcome to review the figures line by line, and I pinned the message across every platform where my name circulated. Within an hour, the speculation that I had exaggerated revenue died a quiet death, replaced with commentary about how rare it was for a founder to publish hard numbers without spin, and while that wave of approval carried me higher in the eyes of strangers, what mattered more was that my relatives now had to watch as their attempt to paint me as fraudulent turned into the very thing that boosted my credibility. My sister Hannah texted me first, accusing me of humiliating the family by airing dirty laundry in public, which was almost laughable considering that she had been the one to joke online that I was probably behind the camera when I was excluded from the group photo, and then my mother called with that tone that sounds like concern but is really an attempt at control, warning me that family grievances should never be turned into spectacle. I told her calmly that I did not manufacture the spectacle. I simply pointed a light at the stage they built, and if the audience preferred my version, it was because I actually told the truth. My father stayed silent, which said more than any phone call could, because silence has always been his weapon of choice when he wants to show disappointment without putting words on the record. The part they never anticipated was the call I received the next morning from a mid-sized television station that wanted me for a live segment. Not about family drama, but about how entrepreneurs can use transparency as a strategic advantage. And I knew at once that taking that stage would cut deeper than any billboard, any scholarship, or any group photo ever could, because it would prove in real time that their attempt to diminish me had catapulted me into a bigger arena than they could even picture themselves standing in. So I agreed, with one quiet condition that the producer accepted immediately. I wanted the shoot location to be flexible, and I suggested we film the interview not in a studio but outside my grandmother's block, with the billboard in the background. When the truck pulled up with cameras and microphones, neighbors gathered with the same curiosity they usually reserve for parades and homecomings. And my relatives had no choice but to watch from across the street as the crew set up a backdrop that featured my face larger than life. The host asked me why I chose to be so open with numbers, and I answered plainly that when people try to twist your story into something ugly, the cleanest answer is to publish the truth so clearly that even your enemies cannot spin it. What I did not add out loud, but what I thought while the cameras rolled, was that sometimes the best revenge is not a clever trick or a hidden jab, but simply being undeniable in front of the very people who built their comfort on pretending you were invisible. When the interview aired that evening, the comments online exploded with praise about honesty and guts, and while strangers cheered, what mattered more was that my grandmother called me again, her voice thick with something halfway between pride and relief. And she said she never thought she would live to see her porch become the backdrop for a broadcast that showed her granddaughter being treated with the respect she had earned. My mother did not call. My father did not call. Hannah sent a short line that read enough already, which I ignored. But my brother Jake, who had always been quick to mock and slow to support, sent me a message asking if there was room for him to invest, which told me that the balance of power had shifted in a way none of them could ever fully undo. What none of them yet realized was that I had one more card left to play, a move that would not only close the loop but force them to look directly at the years they erased me. Because the very same photographer who had once captured their carefully posed family photos without me had agreed to shoot the next gathering I was planning, and this time the invitation list would be mine, the guest list would be mine, and the photo that resulted would hang in a place they could not escape, a new tradition born from the ashes of the old one, and all I had to do was set the date and send out the invitations with a line so sharp they would know exactly what it meant. When I decided that the final move would not be another defensive maneuver but a deliberate act that rewrote the story from the ground up, I sat down with a blank sheet and listed the names of every person who had shown up for me when it was not convenient. When there was no magazine cover, no headline, no billboard to bask in, only the steady grind of building something that nobody believed in yet. That list did not include a single immediate family member, and instead it was filled with neighbors who dropped off casseroles when I worked through weekends, mentors who read drafts of business plans I was too embarrassed to show anyone else, old professors who reminded me that potential is not a dirty word, and the two childhood friends who had been squeezed out of family holidays themselves for choosing paths that did not look like the script. I rented a hall in the community center, the very same one where my cousins had thrown graduation parties and baby showers, and I hired the photographer who had once excluded me from family photos to cover the event with a contract clause that required him to shoot until I said stop. The invitation I sent was a single sheet of cardstock that read in large block letters, "If you were ever told you didn't belong, you belong here," and beneath it I wrote the date, the time, and the note that portraits would be taken for a new family wall. A wall I was building from scratch with people who actually showed up. The night of the event, the hall filled in a way that made my chest tighten, not from nerves, but from the sudden clarity that this was the family I had chosen. A patchwork of support and stubborn belief that had kept me upright when my own bloodline preferred the convenience of erasure. We lined up in groups, people laughing and leaning on each other, and when the photographer clicked the shutter, I watched him realize that the images he was capturing now carried more warmth than any of the rigid porch poses he had ever shot before. At the end, I asked for one wide photo with every single guest in the frame, my grandmother seated right in the front row with a smile that told me she understood exactly what was happening. The next morning, I printed the photo in oversized format, framed it, and delivered it not to my own home, but to my grandmother's living room wall, sliding it directly beneath the timeline of family pictures that had kept me absent year after year. When my mother came by later that week and saw it, she said nothing, but I could tell by the way her mouth tightened that she knew the balance had shifted permanently. My father looked at it once, turned away, and asked if anyone wanted tea. My sister Hannah muttered that it was dramatic. My brother Jake tried to joke that at least this time I finally made it into the picture. But none of them could ignore it, because the new photo sat at eye level, bright and undeniable, while their carefully curated traditions had been pushed up above it, harder to reach, almost like a museum exhibit of how things used to be. The final twist, the one that sealed everything, was the caption plate I had mounted under the frame, engraved in clean metal so it could not be peeled away or erased. It read, "The first annual family portrait of those who believed when belief was not convenient." I did not sign my name. I did not need to, because everyone who stood in that picture knew exactly whose wall they had helped build, and everyone who had excluded me knew exactly why their faces were missing from it. There were no more group photos posted online without me after that, no captions about tradition, no porch gatherings that pretended unity. They still meet, I am sure, but the silence of their feeds told me everything I needed to know: the billboard, the scholarship, the televised interview, and now the portrait had broken the performance, leaving them with the truth they had tried so hard to hide. I did not gloat, I did not send taunting messages. I simply let the picture hang in my grandmother's house where no one could walk past it without remembering that I had stopped asking for a seat and built an entire table instead. And when the applications for the scholarship began arriving, my grandmother called me each week to read aloud the words of kids who had been told they did not belong, and every time she said their names I felt the circle close tighter. Until there was no space left for doubt, I had won, not by begging to be included, not by lowering myself to match their cruelty, but by making myself undeniable in a way that even their silence could not erase. The last move had landed, the portrait was in place, and for once, the story ended not with me outside the frame, but with them staring at a wall that would never again belong only to them.